So, hi everyone, welcome. My name is Maya Schonbach. I'm a clinical psychologist and the clinical program director here at Stop OCD. Thanks for joining. Today, our webinar is all about OCD and relationships and how really OCD affects our connection and how we can use practical skills and tools and how to help uh, improve our relationship satisfaction and stay connected. Our webinar is going to be about 45 minutes-ish. We have time at the end for questions, comments, answers. So please, please, please really encourage you guys to write into the chat anything that pops into your head throughout. And we'll go through them all together at the end of the presentation once it's over. And I also really recommend that you guys stick around to the end of the presentation because we're going to have a promo code for subscribing to Stop OCD. So let's get started. So this is just kind of an outline of what we'll be talking about today. We'll go into OCD and relationships and look at some research. We'll talk specifically, briefly about ROCD or relationship OCD. I really like that topic. I actually did my master's thesis on that. We will then talk a little bit about when care turns to strain and how that impacts, there's all the burden that has to, accommodation and things that are included in that. We'll talk about boundaries, how to label our different needs, basic emotion needs, and then we'll talk about the body and how that shows up there. And then we'll look at some really practical tools about that we can move towards healthier connection. We'll do a quick conclusion and, like I said, the questions and answers at the end. So let's start by talking about OCD and relationships and looking at some research. Really see how OCD shapes connection, communication, and really a sense of closeness. So OCD isn't just about intrusive thoughts and behaviors or compulsions. It really affects how people live, how they feel in their day-to-day, their quality of life, and really how they connect with others. So research shows that even when people with OCD are in relationships, that doesn't mean that those relationships are untouched. In fact, many people actually report only moderate satisfaction in relationships. So that's not terrible, but it's not really nourishing either. And really that's important because it tells us that this isn't about whether you're doing relationships wrong, it's about how OCD kind of changes the relational kind of landscape and in the background. And really the key takeaway is that OCD can affect connection. And this is true whether or not we're talking about romantic relationships, family relationships, friendships, really work relationships, all types of interaction and connection in general with other people. So a really important finding in research, first is what doesn't predict relationship satisfaction, and that is symptom severity. So it's not the severity of a person's obsessions or compulsions that uh, really impacted a person's relationship satisfaction. That wasn't related, they found in the research. Instead, what they found that related is how people really relate to each other. It's the level of irritation, both among the person and their partner, emotional availability, the emotional load that both people are carrying, depression, anxiety, lack of sense of emotional support. And interestingly, they did find that checking behaviors were kind of different because they said that there's an element of checking, like checking maybe about the asking for reassurance, um, that actually pulls the partner closer initially, but that closeness has a cost later on. So that's just an interesting thing. But I think overall, what this relationship by Remerswal and colleagues in 2016, what they found was that it's not about the symptoms of OCD and it's not about blaming the symptoms. It's really about understanding these interaction patterns um, and really understanding that it's not about how severe the OCD is, it's about how the OCD shapes these interactions. So I want to talk about a few different of these types of these patterns. So first is isolation. So isolation is often actually misunderstood because, sorry, when people with OCD kind of pull away or isolate, it's not because they don't care. More often, it's because of an element of shame or fear of being judged or trying to calm their distress or fear of burdening others with their thoughts or with their rituals. People may avoid social situations or stop sharing what they're struggling with, or withdraw to really to keep their OCD hidden. And then over time, this isolation really can create distance in relationships, even when there isn't a desire for closeness. And then the second point that I wrote here is that really there's this loss of spontaneity. And because OCD really thrives on this idea of control, trying to control, and predictability and avoidance. And really, this often means that there's fewer kind of spontaneity in relationships, last minute plans, shared adventures, um, and then that can ultimately make the relationship feel smaller or more restricted. And really the life begins to revolve around trying to manage the anxiety instead of trying to enjoy the connection. And really this idea of this isolation and the loss of spontaneity and the shrinking of the relationship doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual. And often couples or families don't realize really what's happening until they feel really disconnected or really kind of stuck. And so, something that I really want to underscore throughout this entire webinar is that it's not a failure of effort or of love. It's really that it's the OCD in the background really reshaping relationships around typically around fear. Okay, so another pattern is about doubt and anxiety, specifically in terms of intimacy. So, OCD has an often particular way of showing up during moments that are supposed to feel safe or connecting. And so intrusive thoughts, uh, they first of all don't like follow any social rules. They often show up during feelings of vulnerability or closeness, sexual intimacy, um, exactly because those moments feel like they matter so much and there is kind of a sense of weight put on them. And then that can lead people to avoid the intimacy altogether or try to uh, kind of be mentally distant. And then a partner can misinterpret this as a rejection. Um, they can feel maybe lack of attraction or emotional withdrawal when really it's the OCD and the distress hijacking the moment. Um, and so really this dynamic really wears down um, both partners because there's also this idea of excessive doubt and reassurance seeking, checking, and that really drains the emotional energy. Are you sure you're okay? Did I upset you? Do you still love me? And in the short term, reassurance can bring relief and even closeness. And I'm talking about both sides. Yes, not just obviously it's an OCD symptom, but if there's distance, then the other person can come in and also start to feel the need for reassurance, even if they don't have OCD. But um, and then the person also might feel like they're responsible for regulating someone else's anxiety. And so, especially with OCD, the person with OCD, if they have this compulsion of reassurance seeking and checking, then often it's very common that they also feel dependent and ashamed, and the other person might feel drained or frustrated. And again, the reassurance isn't bad. It's just that the OCD turns the reassurance into a compulsion, and compulsions really just erode the connection. Um, and so let's talk about one more pattern, this idea of care turning into responsibility. And we'll go into this a little bit more later. But this idea of misplaced emotional accountability when a loved one begins to feel responsible, not just for supporting someone with OCD, but for preventing their distress altogether. So I have it in the image. If I don't help, something bad will happen. If they're anxious, it's my fault. Um, so really partners or parents or friends might really feel like they need to say the exact right thing or avoid the wrong thing or step in immediately when anxiety shows up. And then over time, they might even start to get into this loop themselves. Um, and then this really creates kind of an unsustainable dynamic. A loved one might feel overly responsible, and then the person with OCD might feel more and more dependent and guilty and ashamed. And again, this is what's really important to underline is that this comes from a place of love and commitment. People want to protect each other. But again, the OCD kind of like hijacks this, and it's kind of an instinct that begins to turn into pressure. And then we'll talk about boundaries later on because that's where boundaries are so essential. Um, and yeah, so I just kind of want to say that it's this idea that it's this context that we're not asking people to stop caring. We're asking them to stop letting the OCD kind of define what caring looks like. It's we don't want to it turn into pressure to fix. We want to be able to show that we care in different ways. Okay. So I want to talk um briefly, like I said, about one specific way that OCD shows up in relationships. Like I said, relationship OCD or ROCD, if you've heard of it. And why am I only talking about this very briefly is because we actually have another webinar this month where we're interviewing an ROCD specialist, Ron Littman, uh, that really will focus on this whole topic more in depth. So if this next little bit really resonates with you and you want to explore it more deeply, then I definitely suggest that you go check out our next the that webinar. So, what is ROCD? So, ROCD isn't a separate disorder. It really is a type of OCD where the romantic partner or the relationship itself becomes the focus of the intrusive thoughts and of the anxiety. So people with oop, people with ROCD often experience persistent doubts about their feelings or about the partner, really intrusive questions about whether the relationship is right or the partner is the one. They have a strong, strong urge to figure things out or to reach some sort of certainty. Um, and really, something important for me to say is that having relationship doubts does not mean that you have ROCD. And having ROCD doesn't mean that your relationship is wrong. Okay? All relationships include uncertainty. All relationships include moments of disconnection, of ambivalence. And really, what makes this OCD related isn't the content of the doubts, it's how repetitive, how distressing, how urgent, kind of how sticky these intrusive uh, thoughts are and how we respond to them. And if we respond to them with compulsions, which are often mental compulsions, in meaning that they happen internally inside our heads, in terms of mental checking or internal monitoring of feelings, or also external, which would be reassurance seeking. Those are very common compulsions in relationship OCD, and how frequently those happen, how distressing they are, and to what goal they serve. So one of the core dynamics in OCD in general is called the trap of emotional certainty kind of thing. So OCD really basically treats uncertainty as something dangerous. So in ROCD, when relationships are kind of targeted, it begins to really demand proof emotionally. So we start to ask ourselves, or the OCD starts to ask us, do I feel enough love right now? Or am I attracted to them enough in this moment? Or does this feel right the way that it should, this relationship? And these questions feel extremely meaningful. They feel important and urgent. But again, the problem um, isn't isn't the content of the questions. It's really that emotions aren't designed to provide certainty, right? Feelings shift, connection, it up goes up and down, it ebbs and it flows in healthy, loving relationships. And so relationship OCD takes these really normal fluctuations and interprets them as a signal that something is wrong. And again, so the attention is often turned inward. Your people are monitoring their internal feelings, checking them, looking for certainty, wonder again, checking and over again if the relationship is the right one. And then here's also something uh kind of a paradox is that the more that you check that you feel, how you feel, the less access you have to genuine connection. Because love is something that you need to experience. And if love is becoming something that you're constantly evaluating and checking, you're not experiencing it. You're not present in your relationship. You're analyzing it. You're in your head. And so over time, this can lead to feeling more disconnection, not because the relationship is failing, but because OCD came in and turned the attention away from the relationship, away from being present in the moment with with your partner and into self-monitoring or monitoring of feelings or monitoring of your partner and the relationship. And so again, it's that not that OCD isn't about loving enough, it's about needing this idea of certainty in order to feel safe. And again, later we'll talk about boundaries, and this is really something that can help us kind of step out of this certainty trap in order to really foster this connection. So now we're going to talk about some really big topics. So like I said, when care turns to strain, so things about accommodation, burden, and kind of strain on the relationship. So accommodation is something that's extremely common in OCD relationships. So accommodation means adjusting routines, offering reassurance, avoiding triggers, or essentially doing any number of behaviors that are meant to reduce someone else's anxiety, the person with OCD's anxiety. So most people accommodate because they care. They don't want to see someone that they love suffering because really this just feels like the loving thing to do, right? If someone has contamination OCD and uh then say the mom has contamination OCD, then their kids will put on will come home straight from school and they'll take off all their clothes and they'll go have a shower right away. And then it'll be more and more and more and put plastic on everything. And these are all certain things that they want to do because they care about their mom, because they don't want to see them suffer. Um, but then it gets complicated because the more accommodation happens, the more burden the loved one tends to feel over time, be it emotionally, mentally, and sometimes even physically. And again, it's not because they're resentful or they don't care, but because accommodation asks people to kind of override their own limits again and again and again. Um, and also importantly, accommodation doesn't just affect the loved one. It also affects the person with OCD over time because what that is doing is it maintains the OCD by teaching the OCD ends up learning that sorry that the anxiety is dangerous and it requires somebody else to step in and intervene and to help me and to maintain the compulsions. And what's important here in and often confusing is that relationship satisfaction can still feel high in these situations. People can still feel closeness and bonded and committed and still be stuck in these patterns that keep the OCD strong. So when we talk about setting boundaries in order to reduce accommodation, we're not talking about rejecting the person. We're not talking about distancing. We're really talking about changing up the role that the relationship, um, that the OCD has in the relationship. Okay? Again, we'll talk about boundaries, but it's about setting them in a way that is caring to reduce long-term suffering, that protects both people, the person with the OCD and the caregiver. And really to it's so hard to do that, but it's also so necessary at the same time. So something that often sits underneath everything that we've discussed so far really is shame and guilt. So it's important to say this really clearly right now is that these emotions, they don't belong to just one role of the relationship. They show up on both sides, the person with the OCD and the caregiver or the loved one. And also, these roles aren't fixed. Sometimes one person needs support. Sometimes the other person needs more support. And sometimes that switches, and it can happen, switch even in the same week. And really what OCD adds to the mix isn't it's not weakness or burden. It adds distress and urgency all the time in the background when you have natural fluctuations in relationships. And so when something feels we have urgency, then your emotions naturally intensify, your reactions speed up, um, your tolerance for uncertainty, it goes down. And so in that environment, both people on both sides start to feel things like guilt for needing support, uh, guilt for wanting space, shame maybe about their reactions, that maybe they don't recognize themselves, maybe they fear being too much or fear not doing enough. And really, these feelings don't mean that the relationship is unhealthy. They mean that these people are trying to stay connected while under all of this emotional pressure that OCD has added to the situation. So really, it's that the OCD often turns ordinary relationship moments into emergency moments. Not because the person with OCD is dramatic, but really it's it's because the OCD signals kind of a threat when there isn't one. Um, and so when guilt and shame show up, they're not signs that someone is failing. They're signs that care is happening in a high stress environment. And really, our goal isn't to eliminate guilt or shame entirely because we can't. That would be magic. And unfortunately, we can't do that. But it's really, we want to learn to recognize them as signals, not instructions telling us how to act. And then there's signals for us to be able to make a change. And we'll talk about some tools later, but to really to understand that we have use these emotions as signals and then to pause and then to have a little bit more room to breathe and understand that the OCD is in the background that's really adding all of this sense of urgency and close closing kind of the flexibility that everyone has in the relationship. So, okay, so if accommodation and closeness can exist together, but they also keep the accommodation keeps maintaining the OCD, um, then we're all kind of stuck asking what actually helps. And this is really where boundaries come in. So, um, really, like I said, OCD affects how we relate. And so some common patterns again are overgiving. So people often give so much time and reassurance and emotional energy, flexibility, often more beyond what they feel is sustainable because they're really trying to reduce distress or prevent harm. Reassurance loops, like I said, um, questions are getting asked and then you're getting answers and then you feel relief really briefly, but then the doubt comes back. And then the relationship, like again, I said, starts revolving around managing uncertainty rather than sharing a life. Um, and then really underlying these two patterns is this idea of guilt about limits. Because people worry, if I say no, am I being unsupportive? If I stop reassuring, am I abandoning them? and really the sense of kind of feeling that like if I set a boundary, something bad might happen or I'll feel responsible. So boundaries really start to feel dangerous. Like they're a threat maybe to the relationship or maybe that you care less. But really, in OCD, honestly in general, but specifically in OCD, the opposite is often true, especially with OCD, because they help separate accommodation from support, right? Accommodation and support are not the same thing. Compulsions, we can separate them from connection. We can separate the idea of um, taking emotional responsibility for anxiety away from caring. And like I said before, relationships with that have OCD affecting them slowly reorganize themselves around fear. And that happens without boundaries. But with boundaries, then relationships really have a chance to kind of reorganize around things that we need: trust, safety, shared responsibility. So again, we're talking with boundaries, we're talking about protecting relationships from really becoming tools that are used by the OCD and then to make room for more kind of sustainable connection. Okay, so let's now talk about boundaries, needs in the body, and this will hopefully help build some insight and also will hopefully a little bit of self-awareness also. Okay, so before we continue, I just want to pause, actually kind of define what we actually mean when we say boundaries. Because for a lot of people, especially with OCD affected relationships, the words boundaries can feel harsh. Like I said, oops, like I said, oh no. Hmm. Um, it can bring up ideas like um, rejection or feeling cold or uncaring or putting yourself kind of first at the expense of someone else. And really, that's not what we're talking about here. Here, when we talk about boundaries, we really mean clear lines between what is acceptable and what's not in a relationship, both emotionally and practically. So we really need boundaries to help us feel safe, to feel respected, to feel valued. They really kind of tell us this is where I end and where you begin. This is where what I can offer, and this is where I need a limit. Okay, so when boundaries are clear, something important happens. Then we can be open and vulnerable without being defensive. We can stay connected without building resentment. We can really care about other people without feeling burnout or retreating and disappearing in ourselves. And so this is really important specifically for OCD because OCD again teaches us that limits are dangerous and discomfort must be removed immediately and care or reassurance must be constantly available. And so setting a boundary could feel like a rejection, even when it's not. But again, we need to kind of underscore this that setting a boundary is not rejection. It's a way to maintain a relationship. They don't weaken a relationship, a healthy relationship. Boundaries actually protect them, especially when fear is trying to kind of take over, especially in OCD. And so got boundaries really are kind of guidelines that help allow the connection to last. So, okay, so why if boundaries are meant to protect relationships, why are they so hard to hold when there's OCD in the relationship? So, really, kind of the short answer is that OCD blurs emotional signals. So, OCD really is a way of disguising itself as a sense of responsibility or care or love. And then people often start to confuse things that kind of normally stay separate. So first, for example, needs often get confused with fears. So OCD creates a really strong internal message that something bad will happen if this feeling of discomfort isn't removed right away. And so over time, anxiety can feel like a need, something urgent that must be responded to, even when it's the fear and the OCD asking for certainty. And then another pattern is that care often gets confused with responsibility. So wanting to support someone slowly turns into feeling responsibility for their emotional state, like I said before. People begin to feel like it's their job to prevent anxiety, to prevent the distress or the doubt, and not just to be present with it. And then a third thing is that reassurance often gets confused with love. So answering questions, checking things, adjusting routines. These can start to feel like the ways to show closeness, to express it. And then saying no or setting a limit could feel like you're withholding some element of care, even when it's not. And so there's often some beliefs is like I said, that if they're anxious, it's my fault. If I don't help, I'm abandoning them. And so really these kind of beliefs, if they take over, then there's no way that a boundary can hold up. And like I said, talked about before, this idea of overgiving and burnout and emotional exhaustion, resentment, this adds to the strain in the relationship. Not because the people don't care, but because really the relationship, like I said, is organized around fear instead of kind of a shared regulation. So something really important to say is that blurry boundaries aren't a failure, a personal failure. They're really the effect of OCD on the relationship. So when boundaries get kind of blurry, one of the first things that really tends to disappear is a clear sense of needs. So people often really stop asking, think to themselves, what helps me stay emotionally present and regulated? And instead, the focus is shifted to almost entirely reducing the anxiety, preventing distress, keeping bad things from happening. And then over time, these just personal needs start to feel irrelevant or maybe even selfish or dangerous. And I really want to be clear. OCD doesn't erase emotional needs, okay? Not for either person. Even if someone you love is struggling, even if anxiety feels urgent, even when setting a limit feels uncomfortable, we all have basic emotional needs that really help us stay balanced and connected. So let's go through these four here. So first we have a need for safety and attachment. So it's this idea of needing to feel secure, to feel accepted, to feel not constantly on edge. That's the idea of safety and attachment. We also have a need for pleasure. We need to rest. We need to feel play, lightness, enjoyment, moments that aren't about managing symptoms or work. We need for pleasure. We also have a need for self-worth. So the idea that you feel seen as a whole person, not just maybe as either the one with the OCD or the strong one. And then finally, we have a need for orientation. So an idea of kind of predictability or clarity and kind of knowing where limits are, boundaries. And so when these four needs are consistently unmet, people don't usually notice it right away. Often, it actually shows up indirectly, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but really there's an idea of kind of emotional numbing or irritability, pulling away, like I said, the isolation, or kind of a sense that the person's there, but not really there. Like I'm here, but I'm not really here. Um, but really what's important to say with about these emotional needs is that you are allowed to have needs even when someone else is struggling. And recognizing your needs isn't abandoning the relationship, it's taking responsibility for your own side of it. And boundaries don't start by saying no to others, they start with being able to say, this is what I need in order to stay connected. So that's the kind of connection between needs and boundaries. So sometimes people tell me, I don't know what I feel, or I'm not sure what I need. I just know something feels off. And so this is really common actually in OCD affected relationships. Like I said, where the attention is constantly pulled towards fear, towards intrusive thoughts, towards what might happen. So when it's hard to access emotions directly, then our body actually becomes the most reliable source of information. So after interactions with people, you might kind of notice different sensations in your body, like um, tension, heaviness in your chest, tightness in your shoulders or in your jaw, a knot in your stomach, feeling drained or foggy, restless, sense of pressure, urgency, guilt, anxiety. So these aren't random. They're signals. And often they're signs that a boundary is missing or that it's being crossed, even if you can't name which one of them yet. So, for example, if you feel exhausted after conversations about reassurance, then your body might be signaling that you have a need for a limit or for predictability, the need of orientation. If you maybe feel tense or on edge before seeing someone, maybe your body is signaling a need for safety or for clarity. Um, if you feel maybe numb or disconnected, maybe your body's signaling that you have a need for rest, for pleasure, for emotional space. Um, so OCD really can make people doubt their internal signals. This is something very common that we know. It can make people doubt and think maybe I'm overreacting, maybe I shouldn't feel this way. Um, but the body isn't judging, it's not blaming. The body's reporting, it's giving us information. So, okay, so I just want to do a quick little short exercise. Just want to you guys to reflect. Just think of one relationship that feels difficult or draining lately. You don't need to analyze it, just notice. What happens in your body when you're thinking about that person? Is there tension, heaviness, warmth, pressure, fatigue? Okay. So we don't need to fix anything yet, but this is simply about listening and noticing. And this is really important because boundaries don't start with rules or with scripts or anything. They start with awareness. And once we can recognize these different signals, then we're going to be better equipped to respond in ways that protect both the relationship and ourselves and not protecting the OCD. So, okay, let's talk now about how we can move towards healthier connection. So, look at some practical tools that will help with that. So, one pattern that shows up again and again in relationships is often uh, imbalance. So, not because anyone is doing something wrong, but again, like I said, OCD quietly reshapes roles over time. And importantly, neither role is chosen freely, right? OCD pulls both people into positions that don't reflect who they actually are in general and in the relationship. So often one person is carrying an emotional load. They're providing reassurance. They're helping, anticipating trigger. They're adjusting routines, doing all of these accommodation behaviors. They're holding responsibility for how the other person feels. And then the person with OCD often can feel more and more dependent, ashamed, afraid of upsetting or burdening the partner, really stuck between wanting closeness and also wanting relief. And this kind of dynamic then pulls people into either giving more and more or relying more and more. And then both sides are exhausted and in different ways. And this really isn't a character or personality flaw. This is an OCD pattern. This is a pattern that's created by the OCD. Like I said, the OCD pulls the relationships towards these short-term relief, reassurance, accommodation. They reduce the distress very momentarily. And then over time, that short-term relief comes at a huge cost. Like I said, resentment, dependence, burnout, less spontaneity. So something really important that I've been saying that I said I think already, is that supporting a person is not the same as participating in compulsions. And also, very important, is that love does not mean removing all discomfort. So in healthy relationships, discomfort is sometimes part of growth, especially when OCD is involved. And when boundaries are missing, relationships often shift from two people in connection to one person managing the other person's anxiety. And really, that's not sustainable. But the goal isn't to stop caring. The goal is to kind of restore a sense of balance. So both people can stay present, to be engaged, and feel fully in the relationship and not in their heads. So what often when people think about boundaries, they often actually start with fear. So they'll ask themselves question like, what will upset them the least? How do I avoid making things worse? What if they can't handle it? But when boundaries are driven by fear, they tend to be short-lived or inconsistent. And really, a more helpful way to start setting boundaries is with looking at needs. So instead of asking, what will reduce my anxiety right now? We ask, what do I need in order to stay present, to be regulated, and to feel more connected in the relationship? And so this is a really powerful shift because in in OCD relationships or relationships affected by OCD, um, needs-based boundaries often sound like limiting reassurance while still validating distress. Maybe setting time boundaries around conversations about OCD. Um, Being clear about what you can offer, and what you can't. And really naming the limits, naming when support turns into an emotional overload. So, for example, you could say, I really see how anxious you feel right now, but I'm not going to answer any reassurance questions. Or uh, I want to support you, but I can't participate in checking or avoidance. So these boundaries, they're not punishments. They're not about control. They're about clarity. And they're really about supporting the person, not the OCD. Um, and a really important thing to remember is that boundaries work best when they're calm, when they're consistent. Um, and you don't need to justify them over and over again, and they don't need to be enforced with anger or withdrawal. Um, it's important when they're steady, when they're predictable, and then that steadiness and predictability, that in of itself actually reduces anxiety over time. Um, and it could be difficult at the beginning and feel uncomfortable, but kind of the opposite of OCD. Short-term discomfort is often the price of long-term kind of stability and long-term trust. So, okay, so we've talked a lot about your needs and your boundaries, and then that could bring up the sense of very understandable concern that um, if I focus on my needs, am I being selfish? And really the answer is no, not especially not when boundaries are used thoughtfully. Healthy relationships are two-way, right? They're not one-sided. They're built on mutual consideration, not self-sacrifice. So boundaries aren't about ignoring the other person's needs. They're about really holding both sets of needs at the same time. And again, if with OCD in the background, that can often be very tricky because the anxiety feels so urgent and the distress is so big and the guilt often shows up so quickly. So, um, it's really important to ask, where do our needs align? Where do they clash? What's possible, but maybe not ideal, but what's possible for us to do in this moment? Um, and really another important point is that you are not required to meet every need that someone has. And they're not required to meet every need that you have. And that doesn't mean that the relationship is failing. That's just life. That's just humans. Um, but again, when boundaries are communicated clearly, when they're respectful, then resentment decreases, there's less misunderstandings, there's more room for trust to rebuild. Um, and so again, boundaries aren't about pulling away, they're about staying connected without kind of disappearing. Okay, so I promised some practical tools. So really these are tools that apply to anyone in a relationship and any type of relationship. Um, so uh like I said, OCD really increases urgency in the background for everyone involved. And so these are practical tools that really help slow the moment down so that uh people can respond intentionally rather than automatically. And so, and very importantly, none of these are about pushing the distress away. They're about staying connected without feeding the OCD. And again, you don't have to use all of them, just saying. Just you could try them out, or even just one small shift can really change the tone of an interaction or of an afternoon. Okay, so let's talk about the first one. So pause before responding. So like I said, urgency is the OCD signal that's talking. So if you pause before responding, that really helps create some space in order to choose how to respond. So whether you respond by saying, I'm not gonna, I see how distressed you are, but I'm not gonna check right now, or um, giving them a hug, or in any way that you choose to respond. You can, number two is to name the pattern, not the content. So really you can say something like, this feels like the OCD is asking for certainty again. Um, really just not the person asking for certainty, but it's naming that it's the OCD. That's a really helpful way of kind of externalizing it from the person. Um, really, number three is staying present and understanding that support is not compulsion. So staying present is support. So staying present in the moment, providing certainty is not. So consistently answering the reassurance um, or participating in compulsions, that's not um, that's not actually support. That's actually supporting the OCD. Number four, check your body. So tension, heaviness, dread, like I said, those are often signals of a missing boundary. So if you can check your body and see what you're feeling, then maybe you can use that as a signal to think, oh, what are my needs that aren't being met? And then you can set a boundary in order to address them. And then last is one, say, just have one go-to grounding sentence for you. So you can say something like, I care, uh, I'm staying, even if this feels uncomfortable. So that's something that you can say to, if you're the person supporting someone with OCD, that's something you can say. If you are the person with OCD, right? You can say, I'm staying, even this feels uncomfortable. That's also a very nice thing that you can say to yourself that could help you withstand the distress. Okay, so let's go through some simple takeaways to conclude um, before we finish up. So the first thing is that OCD affects relationships through patterns, not your personality. So OCD really doesn't change who you are. It changes how interactions really unfold under pressure. And then when we understand this, it helps kind of soften the blame, and then you can be more compassionate on both sides of the relationship. The second thing that's important to take away really is that relationship strain isn't about symptom severity. That's what the research shows. How severe the OCD isn't what predicts relationship satisfaction. Really, what matters most is how supported, how understood, how emotionally safe people feel with each other. Third is that care, doubt, and urgency really can sh quietly reshape roles in the background. Um, so over time, this really can pull people into roles that they don't choose. So maybe giving more, monitoring more, doubting more, even when our intentions are loving. The fourth thing is that boundaries protect connection. They don't threaten it. Like I said, boundaries aren't about caring less. They really help people stay present without feeling responsible for someone else's emotions or for managing anxiety or for eliminating discomfort. And then the last one is just really small shared shifts can restore balance over time. So change doesn't require perfect boundaries or big dramatic conversations. The five practical tools that I said, they're really all about making a small pause, right? You can maybe, or even just setting clear limits, naming patterns. Those are all things that can help reduce strain on a relationship and ultimately support healthier connection. So these are a list of our free resources. You can follow us on social media. I really recommend that. They're really great opportunity for community, a comprehensive center for information, for treatment options, and check out past webinars that are available on our website, stopocd.com, or on our YouTube channel. Definitely check those out. Like I said, also the relationship OCD one. And like I promised, we have a $100 discount for the first month. You can use our promo code PROWEB100. And if you have any questions, definitely write them into the chat and we'll go through them for the Q&A right now. Or if you have anything specific about pricing or about something technical, definitely email customer support@stopocd.com. Or if you have anything maybe private or clinical that you want to ask me, send me an email to maya@helpingminds.com. So I'm going to open up the Q&A. Thank you. That's what somebody wrote. Thank you very much back. Somebody wrote, when you say listen to your body, I really struggle with this as my body's on such high alert. Is it possible that our bodies can fire false alarms with OCD? Thank you for this. Wow, that is a very um, good and accurate comment. Definitely Um, OCD fires false alarms, yes, um, all the time. It makes us feel um, our body get shift into the fight and flight state, even when there isn't an immediate danger that we actually need to deal with. So there definitely is um, something going on with that. And that is something to listen to. And that is something to say, okay, I need to do something to regulate my nervous system right now and to switch me out of this fight and flight mode into the calming, the rest and digest, maybe to do some breathing techniques, to do some grounding techniques. We have mindfulness meditations. You can look up, I think we have in our um, YouTube channel. And in our platform, we have some tools that actually work with a lot of those techniques as well. Are there any other questions? We have some time for a few more. Okay, if there's no more questions, I'm going to stop. Oh, are there any UK-based therapists? I struggle with time difference on Stop OCD. That's a very good question for um, the support. So definitely email support@stopocd.com. Um, Another question is, how do you actually know when a relationship is the one? You don't know. And that is what is very hard for people with OCD in general, but specifically ROCD to deal with because it's the idea of uncertainty. And there's uncertainty everywhere in life and also in relationships. So there is no answer, unfortunately, to knowing. Um, And if you have more questions about this specifically, and you wonder if you're struggling with relationship OCD, definitely look at the webinar with Dr. Runlitman. That'll be very interesting, I'm sure, for you. Last question before we go, or I think it's a comment. Battling cancer with OCD. Wow. Wow, I'm very sorry to hear that. It sounds like a lot on your plate. Um, it definitely sounds like Stop OCD could be something that could help support if you have a lot going on. Definitely important to have someone that you can share that with and support you. So thank you everyone for joining. I hope you all enjoyed and look out for our next webinars. I'm going to stop the recording now. Thanks everyone.